What's one fundamental assumption about fraud prevention that you believe is being challenged or needs to be reevaluated in today's environment?
The fact that fraud prevention is a vertical by itself. I think that recent fraudulent trends have shown us that there is no really separation between fraud, cybersecurity, and IML, for example. So we have to rethink how we separate different silos, the fraud, the IML, the cybersecurity.
Fraud is no longer a phenomenon that is typical just of the banking industry or the financial services at large. For example, in gambling, where a lot of gambling providers have problems with account takeover, bonus abuse, automotive.
We can't ignore the global political landscape, particularly in America. What unforeseen challenges or unique advantages might a European-centric fraud solution offer to organizations operating within Europe?
It's undeniable. There is cultural affinity, geographical proximity, which are factors to take into account when you enter into a business relationship. When it comes to expanding things like product roadmap and strategic direction, it's very important when it comes to something like anti-fraud that there is an alignment between client and provider.
Last year, we were dealing with one of the top 10 European banks. They were asking us to replace an existing vendor that they were conducting a POC with for more than a year, an American one, a very well-established one. And the reason for that was GDPR.
Welcome back to Security Strategist, your blueprint for evolving cyber. My name is Jonathan Kerr and I'm a lead analyst at Cupping Cole. I advise cybersecurity industry leaders on strategic growth and have worked with key figures in industry and government across the globe. I also write for Dark Reading, which is an industry-defining publication. Today, I'm here with Guido Ronchetti, CTO, and Paolo Carmassi, Head of Sales Europe from XTN Cognitive Security. Welcome to the show, Guido and Paolo. I'm so glad to have you here. Why don't you kick us off with a little introduction about yourselves? Guido, let's start with you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, all. I'm Guido Ronchetti. I'm the CTO of XTN and one of the founders of the company. I've been working in fraud prevention for the last 14 years now, so it's been quite a long journey.
Thank you, Jonathan. Grateful to be here. Thanks for having us, and hi, everyone. So my name is Paolo Carmassi. I'm the Head of Sales for Europe at XTN. And my background is very much in payments, where I've spent the last 10 years of my career working pretty much in the city.
Excellent. Well, without further ado, then let's dive into it. So to truly understand the landscape, what's one fundamental assumption about fraud prevention that you believe is being challenged or needs to be reevaluated in today's environment? And Guido, what's your view?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Thank you, Jonathan. I think the thing to challenge is the fact that fraud prevention is a vertical by itself. I think that recent fraudulent trends have shown us that there is no really separation between fraud, cybersecurity, and IML, for example. So we have to rethink how we separate different silos, the fraud, the IML, the cybersecurity, and think about attacks that are actually not dividing their behavior based on the type of team that will look at them. Think about authorized push payment scams, for example. In those scenarios, you will have, let's say, a data breach that is used by the fraudster to access some of the victim's data in the first place. Then you will have some social engineering going on to convince the victim in act accordingly to the fraud behavior, willing. And then you will have the actual fraud or scam. So those three steps are actually strictly interconnected. And if you want to look at the whole threat, you have to consider all of them. And I think this is a challenging part of our organizations in the first place, but also the way we think about the know-how and the skills that are needed to address those types of threats and frauds. Let me make another example. Think about money mules, for example. Those are a very good example of how IML and fraud are overlapping, if you want. So you have part of the flow about mules money that is coming in that is interesting from an IML perspective. And then you have new accounts frauds about synthetic accounts or identity theft and so on. So I think what is really challenging fraud prevention nowadays is to open the scope of visibility, including other areas that are historically managed by different teams and different technologies as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. Paolo, what's your view?
I think, expanding on what Guido just mentioned, I think that there are also some changes that are happening in the sense that fraud is no longer a phenomenon that is typical just of the banking industry or the financial services at large. Mm-hmm. It's something that it's starting to spill out into other industries as well. I can think, for example, in gambling, where a lot of gambling providers have problems with account takeover, bonus abuse, but also in industries that generally you wouldn't think about places where fraud is a significant threat. For example, automotive. You have situations sometimes where automotive providers, they might have apps that are connected somehow to the vehicles. And if if a bad actor manages to get into that flow, potentially they can get access to the vehicle itself, which then potentially poses a threat to physical security and not just pure financial one. So I think that there is this kind of blurring of lines across different industries as well, which is also kind of enhanced by the fact that there is new technology in the picture. The presence of bots, some of which might be good, some of which might be bad, creates additional complexity in how the whole landscape is changing.
Yeah. As another client said to me, everybody these days is a fintech. So yes, everybody is going to have to think about their fraud and obviously a compliance risk. Which brings me on to a question, if I may, Paolo. Beyond regulatory compliance, I think you hinted at this a bit, but let's talk about the untapped opportunity, especially for European organizations. How can they leverage their local identity and data privacy focus as a competitive advantage in fraud prevention?
Thank you for the question. I think that is a very, very important theme within Europe. Generally speaking, giving the thorough regulation and the regulation that is basically has got the customer front and center in Europe, we believe that this is a strongly competitive advantage in the sense that, first of all, it's perceived around the world, rightly so, as the gold standard when it comes to regulation, which for data privacy, which means that what we are seeing is that a lot of companies that operate outside of Europe want to be adhering to the European standards anyway, in order to be able to show their own regulator to take a proactive posture when it comes to data privacy, but also from the perspective of the final user, right? So if we think about GDPR, but also AI Act, which essentially, and here I'm thinking specifically about the explainability of artificial intelligence model. I'm thinking about the data governance and structure of the data that is being used in order to protect or to do a number of different things.
And I suspect that our listeners fall into two camps. They either have deployed AI through their business processes, which means they need to be thinking about, as you say, the fraud aspects of that, or they're actively considering it, in which case this is a great time to consider the fraud, the identity, and the data privacy aspects.
Yes, absolutely. And that also then trickles down into how the final customer is perceiving the service. So if data is used in a trustworthy manner, that certainly can be a source of competitive advantage for whichever financial institution or other provider makes sure that the data and is used in such trustworthy way.
But gentlemen, both of you, we can't ignore the global political landscape, particularly in America. I'm not going to turn this into the politics show. Nevertheless, what unforeseen challenges or unique advantages might a European-centric fraud solution offer to organizations operating within Europe?
From a high-level perspective, first of all, obviously, it's undeniable. There is cultural affinity, geographical proximity, which are factors to take into account when you enter into a business relationship. But the most important side of things is the fact that the importance of having strategic alignment between client and provider, right? a provider operating within Europe, where the European regulatory environment is basically something that is it's like they live and breathe it, right? They wouldn't be able to survive if they were not on top of it. So that's the first thing. But also when it comes to expanding things like product roadmap and strategic direction, it's very important when it comes to something like anti-fraud that there is an alignment between client and provider. And being in that same geographical area makes sure that, from a simple perspective of having the decision makers in the same time zones and just at a couple of hour flight from distance, or even in the same country, that certainly helps and makes sure that both the needs of the client and of the provider are aligned in order to arrive to that win-win situation, which is what you want to have in a business relationship. Last but not least, I would say predictability of the regulatory landscape when it comes to AI, data. What's happening in the US right now, it's a little bit difficult to predict, right? Which creates, from the perspective of providers and also clients that are using those providers in a different geographical area such as Europe, it makes things a little bit maybe a little bit challenging, maybe a little bit unclear. Something worth keeping in mind.
It's interesting. It's something that we're seeing increased interest in cupping a coal, actually, that European-centric solutions and, of course, fraud prevention solutions are something that clients are asking for. Guido, but I'm curious as to if you have a view on that as well.
I think it's useful to make you an example, because we are really having this type of experience over the last few years, interacting with our prospects and clients. So just to make you an example, last year we were dealing with one of the top 10 European banks. They were asking us to replace an existing vendor that they were conducting a POC with for more than a year, an American one, a very well-established one. And the reason for that was GDPR. The point in particular was data sharing. So the problem with that vendor was that after investing more than 1 year in a POC, so a lot of resources on the bank side and on the vendor side as well, going in the details about their compliance capabilities, they were stuck about the fact that they were sharing data between their clients, and some of their clients were outside Europe. So if you think about this small thing, that it may also be an advantage, if you want, from a fraud prevention perspective, was a big showstopper from a GDPR perspective. So, this type of ability to know from a compliance standpoint what is expected from the client, especially for clients that are extremely focused on this type of regulations, is crucial in the European space. And I think that is something that, again, as Paolo was saying, is somehow related also to seeing a trajectory about the regulatory changes in the future. And I want also to stress this point. I think that the IE Act is also pushing boundaries a bit in that sense, because the IE Act and what we are seeing on the US side, if you wish, regarding the initiatives about AI and how it's perceived and how it's seen, the evolution of AI in that space is very different from what Europe is doing about regulating that aspect. So this is another point where we see that clients and prospects are really demanding answers about AI today in Europe. And I think that US-based vendors are looking at it with a very different perspective compared to EU-based vendors and providers.
That's fascinating. Guido, if I may, I'm going to take advantage of I'm going to take advantage of your presence here and our friendship to and ask you a technical question. I'm fascinated by behavioural biometrics, and for those of you on the podcast listening, behavioural biometrics is the science of delving into user actions and deriving meaning from them. What do you see as a seemingly insignificant user behavior that, when you analyze it in your cognitive system, it shows a powerful indicator of sophisticated fraud?
I would say that one of the first that comes to mind is the way we interact with devices, especially with keyboards, mouse, and handset and mobile devices by handling them. And I want to make you a pair of examples that I think are interesting in that sense. One thing that we are increasingly seeing as an issue in the fraud space is the identity validation process. So all of us, after COVID, we have been dealing with a huge change in the way the onboarding works. Most of the online institutions are validating our identity through a camera, using a passport or an ID card, and that's usual now. But there are some limitations about what you can do with that type of approach. And part of the challenges comes from AI again, because you can fake your photo, you can fake the liveness check of those flows. And at that point, the information that the provider has to validate your identity are actually usually legitimate. So we are seeing that part of the challenges that our clients are facing is to have more solid ways to validate if you are a real user that is using its own personal information to register, for example. And to do that, we focus on the way the user interacts with the keyboard and mouse inserting that personal information. So every one of us have some type of muscular memory about our personal information. So if you think about typing your name and surname or your phone number, you don't have to think about it. It's your fingers that are able to type it in, because it's so common to type those information that you don't need to go through your brain in order to order your fingers to do that. It's muscular memory. So detecting and recognizing the fact that the user is using its own muscular memory instead of thinking about what is typing in is, for example, one of those behavioral analysis indicator, and that is very useful in that context to discriminate if you are actually using your password and you are registering and you are that real person, or you are someone that just have a copy of the password and have substituted the photo through Gen AI and is just making some identity theft on someone else. So this is a good example of how a small thing that you would not think about, like typing your name and surname, maybe or can be useful in a fraud prevention flow to discriminate who you are dealing with.
I find that fascinating, and thank you. Paolo, let me bring you back in. Actually, Paolo and Guido, I'm sure you've both got an opinion on this, but let me ask Paolo first, because you've been very quiet and kind throughout. So thank you. Very unusual for a head of sales to be so quiet, actually. So let's let you make some noise. We often talk about the arms race between fraudsters and security. What's one move you've seen from fraudsters recently that has genuinely made you rethink traditional defense strategies?
That's a great question. I'm going to explain how we found out about this and then pass the ball on to Guido for the detail on exactly the behavior of what actually happens. So I think doing one step back related with this question is the importance of having a series of defense mechanisms that are able to not just protect your perimeter, but also to give you an idea of what's happening so that you get the feeling of how things are changing and how you are being attacked in different ways. So one of our clients, essentially, we stopped a series of attacks for one of our clients, which looked unusual in the way that they were performed. And essentially, they were stopped mainly by figuring out that there was a malware that was driving some unusual financial behavior in moving funds from a traditional app to a challenger bank. And in spotting this, we realized that basically something new was going on, which is essentially the shell game malware that I'm going to let Guido explain a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Paolo. I think it's a very fascinating trend. And this shell game, as we call it, it's an evolution of what you would have seen being in authorized push payment fraud. And I think it's telling us that fraudsters are trying to lower the age of their targets. And to do that, they target a very common behavior. Having a traditional bank for most of your banking activity, and then a new bank used just for your online card, let's say, or for traveling. So those two accounts usually have very different fraud protection mechanism in place. Traditional banks tend to have very structured processes. challenger banks tend to be more lightweighted regarding it, and they tend to operate globally, so they have less a clear perimeter to focus on. And so what we have seen is that fraudsters were targeting with the malware those two apps that are within the same device. And by doing that, they were able to move funds from the traditional bank to the challenger bank, to the new bank. And this was a very clever move in order to bypass some of the typical checks that you would have in a fraud prevention flow in that sense, because this is the victim new bank, and this is a usual account where the user will usually move money to. And so by doing that, they were then targeting the new bank and performing the fraud on the new bank that usually do not have a lot of funds, but because it's a card that is used for low-cost transactions. But then with this type of mechanism, they were able to move money from one bank to the other and then exfiltrate the money from the challenger bank. So I think it's very interesting because it's a more complex attack from a technical perspective. It's much more evoluted than just the authorized push payment fraud. And I think it's even more interesting because it's telling us that probably fraudsters are understanding that their actual target, that is usually an over 60 type of age range, is becoming less effective regarding the volume of frauds they can perform. And they are trying to lower the range, targeting people that is in their 40s or maybe even 30s eventually. So I think it's an interesting evolution that we just saw in the last few months. And I think it's a very clear sign that things are moving on the fraudster side.
Excellent. Well, I found this fascinating. So, Guido and Paolo, we've had a great conversation. Thank you so much for being part of it. Just to tie it off, if you could offer one paradigm shift in how organizations approach fraud prevention in the future, just give me an idea, what would that be?
I would say try to go the extra mile, bring something to the table that is above what the simple rules are saying from a regulatory perspective, and bring to the table essentially technology that is holistic across both channels and products, that leverages the latest technology and that ultimately provides a trusted use of data for your final customer. And that can only translate into competitive advantage driven by the trust that your clients are putting in you.
Thank you. And Guido, what's your thought?
I think going back to your first question as well, I think that the future of fraud prevention is really to embrace this cross boundaries between silos, between verticals. So building an holistic view that is highlighting the whole kill chain about ongoing frauds and scams is, I think, the future challenge for most organizations. And of course, this is a challenging thing from an organizational perspective. It means having teams that have the ability to go through those topics in a very horizontal way. So I think this is the future of fraud prevention. I think this is the future of cybersecurity and IML as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Guido and Paolo, for joining us today. And we've had a great conversation discussing XTN Cognitive Security and your place leading the European and the global the fraud market. Also, thank you to everyone listening. We hope you took a lot away from today's podcast. And for more information, do go to xtncognitivesecurity.com. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen and join the conversation on our socials at EM360Tech on X and LinkedIn. For more great content, head on over to our website. I've been Jonathan Kerr. Thank you very much.